Hey guys, and welcome back to Betwixt the Books, and happy Black History Month to all who celebrate. I skeeted out yesterday that I hadn't seen any non-Black creators do Black History Month TBRs or Black History Month recommendations yet this month, and we are only about a week into the month, so I'll give people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe that's something that's going to come soon. But I've seen a lot of just general February TBRs that didn't have any Black authors on them. And if you were watching last week, I talked about how my husband and I just bought a house and that I'm supposed to be moving this month. You might say, Michaela, that's a lot of books behind you that definitely aren't packed up to move. To which I say, that is next week's problem. I'm going to deal with that next week. And also, that might mean, again, that I don't have a lot of content to put out this month, at least solo content-wise, because I'm going to be focusing on packing all of my stuff, moving all of my stuff. I need to set up internet and set all my stuff up at the new house. And it may take me a minute to do solo content once all of this is, packed down and not ready to have content made again. So I don't feel like I can do a TBR. I don't know how much I'm going to be reading. That isn't to say that I don't plan on not reading at all. Here are the books that I've borrowed from the library as audiobooks that I would like to read while I'm packing or driving, because we're moving an hour away, so we'll have a lot of back and forth driving to do. And that obviously also doesn't mean that I don't have loads of Black books on my TBR in general. Here are some of the physical books I have on my TBR. How about the books that I have on my TBR that I don't have on hand? And here are some of the books that I've added to my TBR just from this last week of Black History Month TBR videos that I've seen. It might look like I'm drowning in books to read. And that's never a bad thing. I will always be happy to have more books that I can pick up and read. But I was curious because I haven't seen a lot of stats around the publishing industry since 2020, when we were all looking at those stats post George Floyd and the focus on the Black Lives Matter movement. From what I could find, I don't have specific stats for 2025. But the most recent stats I could find showed that about 6% of the books that were published in the US were by Black authors. That's really low, but it is better than the UK, where only 3% of the books that were published there were by Black authors. And obviously, across the whole world, it's an even smaller percentage. This is just talking about publishing through a traditional publisher where a editor will sign a book, bind it, make it all, and publish it. There are way more books that are published independently than there are through traditional publishing routes for a couple of reasons. The main one seems to be that the publishing industry as a whole is very white. The majority of the people who work in publishing are very white, because they are more or less gatekeepers on which books are chosen to be published, from agents to the editors to the publishing houses at large. Quite often you will see them have one or maybe two Black authors on their rolls of the authors that they represent, and that's it. And unfortunately, in a lot of their minds, that fills the diversity quota that they need to put out, or feel that they need to put out. And they only publish certain types of books. It's much easier for a Black author to publish a book that is around slavery, civil rights, something that has to do with Black trauma, than, say, just a romance book by a Black author. And yes, Talia Hibbert exists, but how many other Black romance authors can you name off of the top of your head? They're out there, they exist, and they are getting published, but I bet you could name scores of white romance authors. And that same thing goes for other genre fiction, mystery, sci-fi, fantasy. All of those Black authors have a harder time getting published through traditional routes, and often go to independent publishing if that's something that's feasible for them, because that still costs money. I'm going to link a couple of the studies that I was looking at and reading with the more updated stats. If that's something that's interesting to you, if you want to actually see the numbers and where they got those, I'll leave that down below, because while it is improving from what I can see from the stats that we have most recently versus just after the Black Lives Matter focus versus before the Black Lives Matter focus, it does seem to be slowly improving, but it's very slow. And I'm worried with the current administration that we are going to backslide, both here and in other departments, particularly with queer books. The insane increase in banned and challenged books are focused on queer books, as well as books that include what the right is calling critical race theory, aka anything that has to do with Black people. Those have led to not just bans and challenged by fringe right extremist religious groups going into communities and asking for these things to be removed from libraries, but because of the extreme right-wing politicians, statewide bans are being introduced, physically banning books from schools and public libraries across entire states. You want to hear us talk more about that? Gretchen and I did a reading roundtable last year where we talked about banned and challenged books, and we're planning to do another one this year. It's something that we care very much about. Gretchen obviously being someone who has worked in a library, and myself just being a person who cares about access to books and that people should be able to see themselves in books. Just because some people don't want to read a book, that doesn't mean that they have the right to make it inaccessible to everyone. In that same vein, I wanted to talk a little bit about why I pick up so many books by marginalized authors to put physically on my TBR behind me. It's sort of a continuation to the conversation I had in the video I did back in September where I talked about TBR guilt, where a lot of people are trying to read down their TBR to not have unread books behind them, and how I personally don't feel guilty about owning unread books. Obviously, the goal of buying all of these books is to read them at some point, but publishing is also a business. In order for publishers to want to pick up more authors from any marginalized group, they need to have a financial incentive, because they're not going to publish books that they're constantly going to be at a loss for. And some of you may be saying, well, if they aren't selling, then they mustn't be very good. I can hear you in the background. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. While the last couple of years, maybe even decade at this point, has made it very apparent that racism is still alive and well in America to folks who thought that it had gone away. Of course, people of color have been saying that it never really went away this whole time, but for a lot of folks, their eyes were opened to the fact that that still exists in a very loud way. It had been quiet for a little while for the most part, but it's back very loud. There was always this quiet bias that a lot of people probably didn't know that they had. If you didn't know, I worked for Barnes & Noble off and on for the last decade at various stores in multiple states. One of the things that they have is a program called Monthly Picks, where a new paperback release in a couple of different genres is chosen by the company to be promoted in particular. There's a couple of reasons for that. They buy a larger market share of that book, and therefore it incentivizes them to sell more of it. But they often also choose authors of marginalized identities. There's quite often a queer book, a book by a person of color. Across the spectrum, you're going to find a pretty good spread of representation month over month. In the store that I worked at the longest, which was the Warwick, Rhode Island store, every single month, mystery and thriller was the most popular genre monthly pick. We didn't even have to hand sell those very often, where a bookseller will be like, hey, this is why you should read this book. It was just on a table and people would pick it up on their own. Even without us pushing it, it pretty easily hit 40 to 50 copies sold a month of just that one title. That was up until the June monthly pick for 2021, which was Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby, who is a Black author who writes in mystery and thriller. That month, I think we sold 2 copies, and that was with us trying to hand sell the book. Now, the cover doesn't have a black person on it. It was a pretty generic, like, purple, smoky scene of a rural town. His name, S.A. Cosby, doesn't necessarily tell you his race right off the bat, and I don't even think the back of the book necessarily said anything about race, but his author photo is there. And despite the mystery thrillers being popular as a genre overall, and this being an interesting one and a well-written one, it didn't sell. And the only thing I can think of for why that is inherent bias of somebody picking it up, flipping it over to read the back, seeing the author photo and going, oh, this might not be for me, and putting it back down, not even really bothering to go much further than that. Which is surprising to me because the novel that he's released after that one, Razorblade Tears, has gotten so much acclaim and has been on multiple of the Black History Month TBRs that I've seen from the Black content creators that I follow. This is just one example of me noticing that this is happening, and I'm sure this happens across the board in every genre, that there are people who just see a black person and assume that they can't relate to the characters in the book and therefore don't even try to. The second thing to sort of understand about a big bookstore like Barnes & Noble is that the booksellers in the store, for the most part, are not choosing which books come into the store. There is a system where they can say, hey, can we get this book that I'm interested in? I would like to hand sell it. And then a person somewhere in the company will say yes or no on that. They don't even necessarily guarantee that we can get a copy. But when it comes to like new releases and things like that, for the most part, that's something done either by corporate or by somebody maybe more local, but who is outside of the store that you physically work in. Generally, the hardcovers that can come in a couple of different ways. There are case packs, which usually have 12 copies of a book. Those are going to be for your big bestsellers. You might even get multiples of those for the big hot releases of the year. Then you can get groups of 5. This is most common for things like your book club picks, where it's not necessarily going to be a bestseller, but more people will pick it up than just something they've never heard of. Again, that might be for slightly more popular releases, but not something that they think they can sell high quantities of. 3 copies, which is for most of the books by authors who've had a somewhat popular release previously or who might be known. And then most books you'll get 1 copy of. Generally, the space on a shelf is going to be dedicated to those books that have more copies. You're going to face out a book that has 3 or more to showcase. And those single copy books will be spined out, so people who are browsing have to choose to pick it up based on the title or the author alone. More often than not, books by Black authors have a tendency to come in as single copies. They get overlooked more often. It takes longer for them to sell. If it takes a long time for that hardcover to sell, the person who's in charge of replenishing stock, so when they get the report of what's sold in the store, is going to look at when that book came out and may go, it came out 2 months ago. We finally sold that 1 copy. We're not going to bring in another one. Versus if it sells the day that it came out, they're going to be more willing to bring in more copies. So the book was not featured. It's harder to see. You have to work harder to want to pull it out, to make it catchy or interesting to you. It might take longer to sell just from that. And then because it took longer to sell, it may not get replenished. And therefore, someone else who's browsing doesn't have the opportunity to find it. Then those sales, which are now diminished for a couple of different reasons, go back to the publisher. The publisher makes a decision on whether or not they're going to put out a paperback. It may have already been part of the deal that they made with the author, both hardcover and paperback. Sometimes the paperbacks are directly proportional to what the sales of the hardcover were. 2, those bookstores then look at those hardcover sales when that paperback comes out and decides whether it's worth it to bring in the paperbacks to have on their shelves in the backlist section to begin with. And they may still bring in 1, 3 copies. You don't really know. And again, those go back on the shelves. But the backlist space is more often than not centered around those heavy-hitting titles that people are still buying. You will get new releases in paperback back there, but most of that shelf space is dedicated to books that the store knows will sell in perpetuity, or at least for a pretty decent amount of time, because it costs a lot of money to ship around those books, and if it doesn't sell, we have to send it back to the publisher. If you didn't know, the books that are in a bookstore aren't always there. When a bookstore purchases books from the publisher, there's usually a deal made that they will house it in the bookstore for a certain amount of time. That is different depending on the books. And if it doesn't sell within that time, they can return it to the publisher for a refund. I don't know if it's a full refund or a partial refund, but they get some money back. And then the publisher has it in their warehouses to sell through other online medias or give it to other stores to sell at a discount. Whatever it is, it gets shipped out of the store again and goes to a warehouse. All of that costs money, and obviously the stores make more money when they sell a book than they get back if they were to just send it back to the publisher. So any book that they bring into the store, they want to sell. They would rather sell it than send it back, but a bunch of books every single month are going to be sent back to the publishers. We like to think that books don't have an expiration date. Once you have access to them physically here, you have them and you can read them whenever, unless they get mold or water damage or burned in a fire, whatever. They can get destroyed, but pretty much once you have a copy, that's your copy and you have it forever. They aren't in the stores forever, and they aren't in libraries forever. This might be different now with this shift to EPUBs. Like, you may have access to EPUBs, but even that is still questionable, because in the same way that a lot of folks are learning about how the licenses on certain games or movies will expire, and then they don't have access to things they thought that they were buying. They essentially were just renting it for however long the platform they were viewing it on had access to it. The same goes for EPUBs. That might lapse. The platform that you read it on might not exist. Whatever reason it is, like, those ebooks also may not be accessible forever. We wish they were, but they might not be, and it might become lost media in that way. Libraries read books that don't circulate because they need to make space for new books that hopefully will. Same with a bookstore. They need to get rid of the books that aren't being sold so that they can make space for new books coming in that hopefully will. And publishers don't publish books forever. They only publish books if they think they're going to sell. And if they didn't sell in hardcover, and they didn't sell in paperback, and they didn't sell in hardcover because they were hard to find, and they only had one copy in the store, so only one person really had an opportunity to buy it, and they didn't sell in paperback because the bookstore decided not to bring in the paperback because they didn't sell very many of the hardcover and it didn't seem worth it. Like, these systemic things stack on top of each other. And all of that then can reflect back and affect the author, because if the publisher says, well, we didn't sell enough copies of your book to pay for the advance that we gave you, we're not going to buy another book from you because we aren't sure that it's going to sell, and this is a business and we need to keep making money. And quite often, a lot of the books that come out in publishing don't break even on their advances. A good amount of the publishing industry, each of these publishing houses, is paid for through their very big, huge books. They'll have one author that they can sell millions of copies, and the revenue from that author is essentially helping to pay for a bunch of other smaller authors who may not sell as well. That grace doesn't extend forever. There is a point where a publisher will say, I'm not going to publish anymore. And again, because it's a business, it's important to speak with your money, so to speak. All of this was to say that when I see a book by an author of color, by a queer author, whatever it may be, I try to pick it up if it is even remotely interesting to me, because I want the publishing industry to prioritize interesting books from people of multiple backgrounds, because that is where the most creativity is seen, at least in my point of view. I thrive on creativity, on innovation, and on diversity. The places where I find that the most are in the wide variety of authors that we could be reading. I looked at my stats for last year on the ethnicity spread of the authors that I read, and take this with a grain of salt, because the race of the authors that I read is not always easy to tell. From what I could see, 52% of the books that I read last year were by white authors. And honestly, that's better than the publishing industry. My reading stats are better than the publishing industry. 8% of what I read were by Black authors. That is because I read intentionally. I pick up authors of color. I pick up works in translation. I make sure that I am trying to create an even spread, or as even as I can, of authors that are writing unique and interesting stories. I know some people like to say, well, I just like to read good books. And the assumption that's there, if you say that and you're only reading white books, is that any book written by a person of color isn't good, which is kind of gross. like I don't know how you could say that in response to somebody saying, hey, I noticed you read 100% white authors, maybe branch out a little bit. And if you're like, well, all of the people who I follow who've made content around Black History Month, and they're mostly just talking about nonfiction, and I'm a fiction reader, which is fair. If you aren't a nonfiction reader, the huge lists of anti-racist nonfiction books aren't going to be for you. Or they're primarily classics. They're talking about books by Black authors in history because it's Black History Month. That's fair if you don't read those. Here's what I would say you can do. Go into whatever media app that you use, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and search for a Black content creator who reads the genre that you prefer. Sci-fi, fantasy, romance, horror, whatever it is. I promise you there are Black content creators out there reading those books. They, more often than any other demographic, are going to pick up books by Black authors because they want to see themselves represented in those books, and they will come to you and tell you these are the great whatever book by Black authors in that genre. I take their reviews more seriously than the reviews by someone like me who has read a Black book, because while I can talk to you about the construction, the pacing, the characters, the way that it impacted me as a reader, my enjoyment, I can't talk about what that book did to represent the Black experience in the same way that a Black reviewer or content creator can. They have a way to talk about the impact that that book has on them that is never going to be something that I can emulate. If you've watched this video and it has inspired you to pick up some books by marginalized creators, whether it's now during Black History Month or any time during the year, take it one step further. Instead of going to Amazon and buying a book by a Black author, see if you can do a quick Google search for a Black-owned bookstore, whether it's something nearby that you can go and visit and pick up that book physically there, or whether it's something online that you can order through their store. Because then not only are you supporting a Black-owned business with the bookstore, an Own Voices writer with the book, and you've watched and found a Black content creator. So you are supporting all of these people in the system to make sure that their stories continue to be told, that they continue to have a livelihood in the careers that they have chosen and want to, or just supporting their hobby if it's a hobby. And out of that, you get a great book that you get to read and hopefully love, and maybe a new author to follow. Hope this made sense. And if you have any questions about the book selling side of the publishing industry, please feel free to leave them down below. If you have any Black content creators that you've found recently that you love, please recommend them to me as well, because I'm always looking for new content creators to follow. I'm going to leave a link to a couple of the folks who I've really enjoyed their videos so far this week. Some of them are going to be on Instagram and some of them here on YouTube. I actually finally managed to get my Instagram algorithm to not be so white, skinny Visto girl centered, and I'm loving it over there at the moment. I had to get rid of TikTok because of the way that it has aligned with the surveillance state here in the US. So I don't have that at the moment, unfortunately. But if you have any recommendations for books I should add to my TBR, because I'm always adding those as well, I would love to hear them. And again, I don't know if I'm going to have a video next week, but I will talk to you again soon, probably at a new house, though maybe not. We'll see. I might try and film something this weekend that I can put up soon, and I'm working on a couple of videos in the background. I will talk to you again soon. Bye.